third webinar in our Baltic University program series, Education for Sustainable Development and Digitalization. And apologies for sending out the link with the wrong date in the web headline yesterday. It was a note to myself, once more, beware of copying an old message. My name is Cecilia Lundberg, and I am the Center Director of BUP Finland. And this is the second webinar series on the topic of ESD that we arrange in cooperation with Shepard Renje at Svedest at Uppsala University and the BUP Secretariat at Uppsala. The earlier webinars this season, or this during the autumn, have discussed communication and digitalization in the situation of a pandemic, and we have also got an important reminder of the dark side of the production of all computer mobile gadgets. Today we have another important but perhaps not so discussed question on the table. In the name of sustainable development, we have a debate on what we eat, how much and which car we use, how much textiles and plastic we consume, and what we think about flying. But what about the climate footprints on the digital technology that we use? Streaming of music, cloud storing, sitting in endless Zoom meetings, etc. Jukka Manner is professor in networking technology at Aalto University here in Finland. And he will now dig into that in his presentation called The Negative Impact of ICT in Respect of Energy and Resource Demand. And this keynote will be recorded, but not the discussion afterward. I encourage you all to ask questions and write comments. You can use the chat under or after the talk, but afterward you are also free to raise your hand and ask for your turn to speak. But now over to Jukka, please.
Okay, so good afternoon from my side. Let me share some talk. Let's see how long this goes. There's so much to say and so little time, as always. It's one of my favorite topics to maybe raise another view on ICT and how great it is, and or how not so great it is sometimes. I'll switch to full screen so I won't see the chat and anything while I'm speaking. So just put your questions in the chat and we can discuss them after my talk, because I can't see them now, and I guess we'll stop the recording after my presentation so we can then discuss freely and bash different topics if so needed. So I hope you can see this. Yeah.
Yes, we see it.
Okay, good. So I slightly changed the topic, or anyway, the point was to discuss a bit the ICT itself. I guess I understood you had this presentation about the materials and manufacturing and things like that. So I'm not going to focus that much on that one. I had one slide about that topic, but maybe looking at another perspective. So I have structured this in 3 phases. So I'll talk a bit about, how sustainable or let's say how ICT has evolved as a technology, and then talking about the growth of ICT and maybe discussing ICT services and trying to make my point across. And of course, we'll have a discussion later. One document that which is surprisingly good in discussing the climate and environmental issues is actually by the Finnish Ministry of Transport and Communication, published about a year ago. Of course, typically these governmental documents are not necessarily the most insightful or most fun to read, but this is surprisingly good. and in a Finnish way, honest discussion on what the downsides of ICT are, not simply that it's great and it's the best thing ever, but also what are the downsides. And so it's an easy to read, maybe 25-page PDF. So maybe you should be able to find it. Of course, I can send you these slides if you like to disseminate slides afterwards and so forth. But there's one picture in that which talks about the ICT sectors in terms of climate and environmental challenges, so what the good sides are and what the negative sides are. So of course it has a lot of tremendous positive impact on many areas, but also negative ones. So I'll be talking mostly about the bottom row, so the negative impacts, and maybe focusing more on the energy and maybe resource consumption, not that much on the raw materials and emissions into the water, because of course emissions come from on one hand the energy production, and then of course the materials and building those devices and so forth, trying to reuse the materials and so forth. But maybe the lower left-hand corner is my main topic for today. Now, of course, any technology, same as ICT, develops and gets better over time. I didn't know how interactive we could make this, so I didn't plan on using Presem or things like tools like that today. But let's say that if we talk about computing, then how much would you expect that the sheer power of computing, let's say the power of computing chips, has evolved in the past 30 years? Say 1,000 times. So 30 years is because that's when I started my university career as a student, around 29.5 years ago, give or take. So would you expect that the ICT hardware, the sort of processors, have become 1,000-fold better, or 10,000 or 100,000 or 1,000,000 times better in just 30 years? So the answer is 100,000. Think about it. 100,000 times more processing can a processor do than it could do only 30 years ago. 100,000, so that's 10 million% more can be done with a single processor than was done earlier. Of course, you can do your own math, but it's about the Moore's law and how more eventually sort of how the chips increase in performance and complexity over time. And just as an example, back in the 1990s, the left box or set of boxes was the fastest supercomputer. Fastest supercomputer back in 1990, the world's #1, could do 22 gigaflops, which is a measure of computing performance. So it's billions of floating point operations per second. The right side is my smartphone. It's 3 years old now, going 4 years old now. It does, I personally calculate it, the calculator benchmark said 14 gigaflops on my smartphone, and the graphics chip, according to specifications, would do 489 gigaflops, 20 times more calculations than the fastest supercomputer in 30 years ago. On the left side, you do a lot of hardcore scientific calculation, cancer research, you name it. On the right side, I read emails and watch YouTube. I have a supercomputer to check emails and watch YouTube and such. I mean, put that into perspective, it's just crazy, mind-blowing. But let's continue discussion. That's not the word, that's not the best case. Here, for example, this is the M1 slide from the Apple's M1 presentation, so their newest laptop processor generation. And it claims that with the graphics chipset, it could do 10.4 teraflops, which is 10,400 gigaflops calculations, which is 500 times more than the fastest supercomputer 30 years ago. And that's a laptop processor. A laptop, not the supercomputer. So just mind-blowing how the increase in computing performance has materialized in reality. If you talk about networking, then how would you expect that the speeds of networks and the speeds of your home connectivity has increased in the same 30 years? If we take the same options, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 300,000, a million-fold, which are, of course, insane numbers put into context in any other technology sector except ICT. Then the answer is 300,000. And there's a concept called Nielsen's law, which is about estimating the speed of networks through time, and you can Google that. But even without that, you can just do the math. On the left side was the high-speed home connectivity back in 1990s, 2,400 bits per second modem. On the right side, just an example of Telia's advertisement, you get the 1 gigabit per second fiber to the home, or as they advertise their 5G networks, 1 gigabit on 5G connectivity. If I did my math right, there's a 400,000 times increase. 400,000 for your home broadband connection in 30 years. Let's continue. Talking about power efficiency. So now, as processors have become better, then you can also calculate it from perspective that how much calculations you can do with the same amount of energy. So if let's say you have a 1 watt or 1 kilowatt of energy, how much calculations computing you can get with the same amount of energy. Again, if you take these same ones, 1,000, 10,000, you can probably expect that I started with C and then I went to D. So what is the right answer for this last one? That's today. It's 1 million. Again, that's called the Kumis Law. You can Google that if you are interested. That's also, it's not the law of nature, but it's a revelation that how the power efficiency of these microchips has become better over time. Let's take the example. Left side was the supercomputer back in the 1990s. I found a specification that it was using 360 kilowatts of energy. I didn't check how much my USB charger uses, but 1-2 watts maybe, and I can then run my phone for a while with that amount of energy. So I don't need a law to figure out that, to take the device back in the days and today, and they had roughly the same computation, if not more, on my phone. The GPU does even more than the supercomputer, and still uses, a small USB charger, or I can charge it in my car, which is of course, almost nothing compared to the left side. So there is a huge difference here. So that's about how much the performance of ICT hardware, not software, hardware has changed. So if we jump, need to put the watch so that I don't go too much overboard. But if you talk about the growth of ICT, then I have some trends here. This is from ourworldindata.org, and showing how data is from World Bank and ITU, and there's the author mentioned. So how the number of internet users has grown, and back in 2016, based on this, there would be 3.5 billion internet users. So it stops at 2016. Then I have another slide, which is from the Cisco's Visual Network Index, one picture from their report, so the VNI report, and it continues from 2018 and grows, and I guess this year, give or take 5 billion people would be connected to the internet. But the growth rate is only 6% per year. So which is not a huge growth rate, of course. There is a limit on how many people on this planet there are. So obviously the growth should stop at some point. Then if you look at that's about the people, then we can look at the amount of devices, again from Cisco's Visual Network Index. This shows the trends and expectations of how the number of devices is growing through time. And the interesting here is, of course, to look at, on one hand, the blue one, which is about the machine-to-machine or IoT solutions. So these embedded ICT here and there and everywhere. And if you look at the percentages, then in the future, half of the devices, or next year, if not already to this year, half of the devices on the internet would be these machine-to-machine and IoT type of solutions. Smartphones, the percentage of smartphones would drop from 27% to 23%, and then the rest is non-smartphones, TVs, PCs, and so forth, which are becoming the minority. TV is also surprisingly big at 13% in the past, and maybe dropping to 11%, but still a huge number. So that's about the devices. Then there's slightly better accuracy in this picture, looking at the amount of traffic that these devices are generating. And there, if you remember, there was the users connected growing by 6% per year. Of course, there is an upper limit, but the internet traffic here says combined annual growth rate 30%. Now, if we stop here for a minute, then here it's worth noting that now the blue bars are not the machine-to-machine, but that's the smartphones. So this year, the expectation is half of the internet traffic is from smartphones, even though they were not the majority in the number of devices. And the machine-to-machine or the IoT topic, the brownish colored, and that was the majority in the number of devices, but it's far from the majority in terms of amount of traffic. So there's a lot of these devices, but they are generating very little traffic. The biggest is smartphones, and then comes PCs and TVs in this. So kind of the story changes when you look at the amount of traffic here. So, I mean, putting into perspective, in the ICT, you have these huge growth rates, and traffic increases a lot. I mean, for example, the traffic in the previous ones was growing more or less, 3 times in 5 years. Then how would the world look like if road traffic increased that fast, or air traffic, or big ships and things like that? So it's interesting that any other sector which would grow like this, we would be really screwed from the sustainable environmental perspective, but not because of ICT. ICT's growth is just peanuts, or maybe not. Let's continue my discussion, but just putting it to context. Now let's talk a bit about the ICT energy consumption. So note that on one hand, we have this million-fold increase in efficiency of computing in 30 years. But then at the same time, we have these growth rates in terms of users and devices and traffic and so forth. Now, to understand really the ICT's energy consumption or energy usage, that's a very difficult or almost impossible topic. There are parties who have tried to get some notion of that, and have some numbers coming. Usually the challenge is, just read, for example, a report about the Finnish ICT sector energy usage, and it depends on where you are talking about companies, for example, offering ICT services, or are you talking about companies using ICT services? Just as an example, for example, maybe the biggest ICT company in Finland called Nokia, then it's a different discussion. Are you talking about Nokia's internal energy consumption, or are you talking about the energy consumption of these operators worldwide who are using Nokia equipment? Or whether it's Apple, so is it Apple's own energy consumption, or is it the millions, or is it nowadays billions of people using Apple products? And is it about their energy consumption? What are you measuring? So it's a totally different discussion here. But some past analysis, Gartner had a report back in 2008 claiming that ICT created 2% of worldwide CO2 emissions, considering what the internet and ICT was back in the days, not that big of a deal as today, but already back then it was the same as airline industry. So if you consider flying air traffic is bad for the environment, then ICT was at the same level. Of course, you can then have the philosophical discussions, how much of air traffic is important, like shipping corona vaccinations around the world fast and quickly and so forth, but that gets then into the philosophical side. The Finnish report, the one I showed you in the beginning of this talk about the climate and environmental strategy for the ICT sector, there's one paragraph or two there where they have also tried to find some numbers from various reports, and the range is huge, from 4 to 10% of global electricity consumption and around 3 to 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So, but not insignificant. It looks like to me small numbers on one hand. Of course, on one hand they are big numbers, but again here it slightly depends on what is considered ICT sector here, and is it all companies using ICT or not. Gartner also had back in 2008 a discussion in that report about data centers. So DC here is short for data centers, and they had an estimate that data centers would increase their energy consumption by 16 times in 20 years. I don't know what the current situation is, but that was, again, back then they saw that there is going to be a huge increase in how much the ICT related data centers would simply grow. Then in Nature, there was an online article about discussing data centers and ICT energy consumption, and there's data from Anders Andrei in this graph. And this is kind of alarming if you look at how this estimate claims that what would happen during this decade, growing from maybe this single digit to 21% of global electricity consumption would be related to the ICT. So not anymore single digits, double digits. And here you can see how that might be distributed. So data centers, big part today, but in the future it might actually well be networks and even mobile networks. I have a slide coming about mobile networks in a moment. So it might be that actually the mobile networks might be the biggest energy consuming party in the future. But again, these are very difficult projections, and what will materialize in 10 years, no one knows, but still some data would indicate, huge changes. This slide, the title is in Finnish because this is directly from Ficom website, but the point here is this is data from Finnish operators, and it's about how many kilowatts energy do you need to transfer 1 gigabyte over the mobile network. So mobile network, 1 gigabyte, how much energy is needed? And back in 2014, you need 1.6 kilowatts to transmit 1 gigabyte of data. And that has dropped, as you can see, really great. And it's now around 220 watts per gigabyte. So again, you can see how the kind of energy efficiency of the hardware, the technology itself has become, and how that is showing in these numbers. However, what has happened this is the Finnish market, what has happened to people's data usage over mobile? This is data from DNA's reports talking about the average mobile data consumed per month per subscriber. And you can see that it has grown from 2014 it was 3.5 gigabytes, and it has grown 10 times to 2020. Tenfold. So what happens if I simply do the math? I calculate amount energy per gigabyte times how many gigabytes a person uses per month. Simple, simple calculation even I can do, hopefully. So back in 2014, an average DNA user consumed, give or take, 5.6 kilowatts of energy to get his or her mobile data per month. And that's the energy consumption on the operator side, not the individuals, but the operator side. 2015, that dropped to 4.5. 2016, back to 5.6, 6.4, 6.7, oops, 7.3, oops, 7.7. So technology has become much better, but just people start using that more. And with unlimited data plans and cheap subscriptions, this is what happens. The absolute energy consumption per subscriber has increased, not 50%, but I don't know, 40% during this time frame. So technology great, usage not so great. And based on various resources, you can easily do the math that cellular data transmission, at least today, can easily consume 1,000-fold more energy than, for example, a Wi-Fi hotspot. So, for example, if you are at home and you have option to use Wi-Fi in terms of cellular, switch to Wi-Fi and you are doing an green decision. And but just a note that mobile connectivity is not cheap in terms of energy consumption. That's extremely expensive. As mentioned, I don't want to focus on the manufacturer. I've been more talking about direct energy consumption. Of course, you have the manufacturing side. Maybe I'll just highlight one slide from Syke, so the Finnish Environmental Institute, if I remember the English term right. But you can probably find their presentation online. But they had a good discussion on ICT devices and their usage and so forth. And this is just a summary slide, but making the point that they need a lot of raw materials and rare materials, and the devices have short lifespans and limited repairability, and recycling is probably more fiction than fact on how you can recycle the resources and the materials on an ICT device. So, but I won't tackle the device side more in this presentation, but these people from Syke have done a lot of work on that respect, and you probably can find more information about that from their publications. So really thinking about, is how sustainable is ICT really, considering that, this growth in manufacturing, needing resources, needing energy, and growth of energy consumption, despite the huge increase in hardware performance, and hardware has become much better. So maybe, I don't know if I have 5 minutes or something left. So that's really the kind of the critical question of what we are currently having research projects on at Aalto, trying to roughly understand why is this energy consumption really growing despite these tremendous achievements in hardware design. As you remember, that 100 times more computing, 300 times faster networks, a million-fold increase in power efficiency of computing. Now, there is a limit, as mentioned already, that there's a limit on the internet users, and there's an upper bound. But the challenge is that there is no limit on internet traffic and computing. In the ICT sector, typically more is more. So something is more, then that's great. And more computing, faster, more graphics, more and more is always the goal. If you consider car industry, airline industry, almost any other airline industry, then less consumption is what drives the technology. But the ICT sector as a whole, now talking about especially the software and service sector, is not really doing that. I'm trying to summarize, but going towards the end. So we can still look at maybe some of the services and what's good or bad about them. But as an example of maybe talking quickly about digital services, maybe about videos, web content, then the IEA and OECD had a report where you can do the math that the Bitcoin mining back in 2020 consumed more energy than Apple, Facebook, and Google combined. Actually, 3 times as much energy as these 3 huge companies consumed. And how many of us are kind of critically needing Bitcoin today? And so you can consider whether it's good or bad. I don't want to comment on the Bitcoin's usefulness for the society at large, but just to put it in context. And there was an article in Fortune which claims that 1 Bitcoin transaction consumes over a kilowatt of energy. Someone buys a Bitcoin or pays with Bitcoins. It's 1 kilowatt of energy that is consumed. I hope people are not using Bitcoin in the future, because that would probably kill our planet. Think about it, 1.5 kilowatt hours for just 1 single transaction. Just unbelievable. Machine learning is another topic. I don't have time to discuss it today, but that could also be one of the next big problems from a perspective that this machine learning and AI algorithms need training, needs development, they need data to properly function, and creating those models and teaching them and learning just takes a huge amount of computing and data transmission. So that actually costs to develop these software algorithms. And if you talk about the video side, which I mentioned there, then based on this Cisco's VNI report, this year, internet video, so all these YouTubes and Facebook videos and TikToks would be roughly 75% of the internet traffic. And the IP video on demand managed video, I guess that would be Netflix and HBOs and Yle Arena and what have you, these. So if you add those together, 82% of global IP traffic is video. So all those who talk about how great ICT is and how much it solves all these things, but still looking at what fills the internet, what fills mobile networks, why we need 5G and high capacity for the consumers, it's because of these internet videos. It's not the kind of useful services, the web and data where you can see the dark blue, which are needing this, but it's videos and those which are filling the networks currently. Then maybe as a last, and then I'll summarize, talking about web pages. So this is one trend line from HTTP archive showing the growth, the median size of desktop web pages and median size of mobile web pages. And in roughly 10 years, the median desktop size has grown by 350%, but the median mobile over 1,000%. I've been naive myself because I thought that when people do these mobile versions of a website or a web service, then that would be somewhat lighter than the desktop version, but that's not the case. It's just simply different format, but it's as heavy and as much data intensive as the desktop and mobile. So there's practically no difference nowadays, which is kind of surprising. I would have expected that there would be a difference, but in practice, no. We have done an analysis at the university here, and we'll get those data and the report out at some point. But we were looking at the top 1,000 web pages used in Finland and how they are structured. and found out that you can have, these web services even in Finland. Some of them are only 0.5 megabyte of size, but some can be even 60 megabytes of data, or even actually one sad case was 100 megabytes of data was transmitted when I loaded the front page of a Finnish web service. So the huge span, 50% of that is graphics. Actually, these worst cases means that there was more closer to 95% was simply graphics. 40% on average was lots of different third-party content that comes from here and there. And the textual part, so if you take a news site where you are reading something, that's maximum 1%. So your cake is that 1%, and everything else is the icing on the cake to make it look good. And of course, track you and all sorts of features and stuff. But the cake, the heart of the cake is 1%. So there's huge savings that can be done by optimizing image sizes, removing unused stuff and things like that. But people are not doing that, most probably because they are in a hurry. So what gets quickly done is what's good enough for business, and then let's forget about it. So these websites have huge potential to being better. So there are trying to summarize finally. I promised to summarize already a few minutes ago, but so there's huge challenges in the ICT sector in terms of the amount of content, but also the amount of processing needed to run these services. But also actually as a sad point, how software is written nowadays. Janne Kalliola, CEO of Exove, a Finnish software company, had a brilliant presentation a year ago in one Finnish seminar, and the Finnish translation of his message was that software needs to be written fast by companies, but it does not to be fast. So the point here is that anyone ordering a new or buying a new digital service or commissioning some software company to write some solution, no one wants to pay for optimizing that solution to be resource efficient. Everybody wants that to be as cheap as possible. No one spent, because then doing an efficient solution needs more time, more manpower, more money. But no one is really interested in doing that. So typically the cheapest price wins. So the one where people write it as fast as possible and quickly as possible, and get something running as quickly and easily as possible. And that's kind of a totally wrong direction, at least today, and that's why all these for example, my smartphone and your smartphones are supercomputers, because the software is so bad on your systems that they need to be supercomputers to run a simple web browser. It's just mind-blowing how crappy software today is. So we definitely have a problem, and this is my last slide, promise. So my message is that the ICT sector and all ICT services would also need to be better. It's just not that you can claim that ICT helps other sectors, so ICT can be crappy itself, but how we are building these services, how we are developing them and running, even teaching our students how to do software, how to program, that has to change. We need to make ICT itself also much more resource efficient than it has been so far, because the problem here is that the software engineers have been misusing what the electrical engineers have been able to create. So electrical engineers have created these hugely powerful networks, powerful processors, these hardware benefits, but software industry just eating everything. But that's my talk today. I went slightly overboard, but hopefully we still have roughly 20 minutes time to discuss. So I'll stop sharing now, and if you want to stop recording, and then we can have the discussion and arguments and so forth. Hopefully this was enjoyable.